cap and trade plans in Congress. Now there are two basic, let's talk about those a little bit. There are two basic ways the government is looking at, Washington is looking at increasing government power over industry on behalf of this alleged crisis. The first is through congressional action, through laws, and the second is through EPA action. The first through congressional action is through this cap and trade type bill. And the second bypasses the entire legislation process and just goes straight through regulation to the EPA. So you see the difference between the two? Now, the background to all of this comes out of a century, I think, of alarmist propaganda that has grown and grown and grown. It comes out of a culture, I think, a culture, philosophic culture, that's actually looking for some horrific disaster to fall on us, and is desperate to find such a disaster. You go back and read the New York Times going back to the 1920s and 30s, you'll find that in the 1920s, they were predicting massive global cooling. You go back into the 1880s and 1870s and read the first people talking, Arrhenius, who first came up with the idea of the metaphor of greenhouse gases. He was afraid, they were all afraid of a new ice age, because they had come out of the little ice age in the early 1800s, and they were desperately afraid that the glaciers would return. And they were afraid that lower CO2 might cause a return of the glaciers. They were afraid of a new ice age. So in the 20s, you'll find the New York Times printing, oh, there's an imminent return to global cooling. Then you'll find in the 30s and 40s articles saying, maybe the Earth is warming up unprecedented warming. And then you'll find cooling again in the 60s. Remember nuclear winter? The idea the Earth was going to get cold again. And then you find in the 80s and 90s, of course, the global warming. And now the environmentalists are back at the beginning. You notice that global warming is actually passing away. Now it's climate change. What does climate change really mean? What's the change in terminology mean? It means it's very simple. See, even though I'm an academic professor, I talk straight on these things. The issue is very, very clear. There's a disaster that's going to hit us, but I have no idea what it is, but I know it's coming. Now, anybody that says that doesn't have any idea what you're talking about. They're just motivated by the desire that there's going to be a disaster. And that's really the motivation behind all of this. There's going to be a disaster, so therefore we have to regulate. And when you hear that kind of thing, you know that regulation and control is ultimately the actual motive. And that's the motive behind all this. Now let's talk about cap and trade for a minute. The unleashing of the dogs of cap and trade has come out of years of lawsuits, which culminated in 2007 with a Supreme Court decision. A series of states, led by Massachusetts, but also others, I believe it was like 17 states and municipalities, sued the EPA. The Bush Environmental Protection Agency, basically at its head Stephen Johnson, had refused to declare carbon dioxide an endangerment, made an endangerment ruling against CO2. They refused to declare that carbon dioxide was a danger to public health. Now, they're correct not to declare it as such. Anybody here ever run a greenhouse? If you want to run a greenhouse, what do you have to do to get the plants bloom? You pump CO2 into it. In researching my article, I found a website that gives you advice, in case anybody here is interested in this, on how to grow marijuana. In case anybody here is interested in that. And what you have to do is you have to pump the CO2 in your basement up to about 1,000 parts per million. Bear in mind the CO2 in the atmosphere now is about 380. So what you have to do is about triple the CO2 in your basement to about 1,000 parts per million, and this causes the plants. Higher CO2 causes greater plant life, right? And so the idea that CO2 is a pollutant it's just blatantly absurd. Now, there are thresholds of this, of course. You get above 2,000 parts and it starts to become detrimental to plants. Like anything else, there's a range, right? But the idea that it is a pollutant and dangerous to life is simply absurd. CO2, I'm breathing. And by the way, the idea that plants stop at 2 is also absurd. Plants, of course, interact with their environment. When plants die and rot, they give off CO2 when they rot, after they're dead. So the idea that the Amazon is replenishing the atmosphere, oxygen in the earth is ridiculous. When an Amazon plant dies, it rots and gives off CO2. The whole thing's ridiculous. So the Bush EPA refused to declare CO2 a danger to public health. So these states sued, and the Supreme Court came back with a decision in 2007 that said, if the EPA declared CO2 a public endangerment, then the EPA must invoke the Clean Air Act and regulate CO2 as a pollutant. You get the connection in the logic? If the EPA declares CO2 an endangerment, then they must invoke the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act was, of course, first originally designed for automotive exhaust and that kind of thing. It was never designed for this kind of thing. Now, then in the summer of 2008, the Bush EPA released an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in which there was a clear warning issued by the EPA itself as well as by Susan Dudley of the Office of Regulatory Affairs that said if you use the Clean Air Act as the guideline for EPA regulation, it will cause the powers of the EPA, of this agency, to magnify and grow to the point where it will affect every household in the land. And that is a quote. Every household in the land. It will end up with regulation of lawnmowers. There will have to be a CO2 standard for lawnmowers, a grams per meter standard for the regulation of lawnmowers. It would require permitting, federal building permits for commercial buildings. Every building in the United States heated with natural gas would fall under federal permitting authority. It would require the regulation of the digestive systems of cows because they fart. And this gives off methane, which is one of these gases. You can't make this stuff up. I'm not good enough of a fiction writer. This stuff is all there. This stuff is all there. When farmers till the soil and turn the soil over, it releases CO2. It would require then small farmers to register their agricultural activity, and it would put in the neighborhood of 2 million small farmers out of business because they would simply be unable to bear the regulatory costs. The Bush administration, to its credit, I'm a big critic of the Bush administration on many issues, but in this regard, they laid out a clear warning to the American public in this advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Use of the Clean Air Act would expand this agency's regulatory power to the point where it would inject itself into every area of everybody's life and affect, quote, every household in the land, unquote. In response, and this, by the way, this notice of proposed rulemaking came out because President Bush issued an executive order which ordered the various cabinet departments to cooperate in complying with the Supreme Court order. Why did he have to order the various departments to cooperate? Because this order would allow the EPA to take over jurisdiction over many areas now controlled by other cabinet departments. For example, EPA would now take over many areas now controlled by transportation. The EPA would now be able to set national speed limits. Just to take one example, if EPA decides that CO2 is high on the highways, EPA could set the speed limits at 55 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour if it decides. So EPA, there'd be no cabinet energy. EPA can obviously take over almost all the controls of the energy department. Right? So EPA would become the super totalitarian agency in Washington. And it was all laid out in this because CO2 is such a ubiquitous gas, and we give it off when we breathe, cows give it off when they fart, you give it off when you turn a spade of soil, you give it off when you turn the thermostat. The federal government would be empowered to put in electronic thermostats in your home and monitor your home thermostats, and even to require thermostats centrally set by the government. All of this is laid out, and I'm not making this up, and it's not inference and it's not extrapolation. It was all laid out. So now, with the new change in administration, the head of the EPA has changed, and the new EPA administrator, Jackson, is a real ideologue on this issue and shares none of this reticence. She almost immediately has declared CO2 to be a public danger, and they're writing all these regulations now. They have expressed, however, their preference